Welcome to the Monsters of Fantasy. This was written, produced, recorded, and edited by me, Shawn McCarter. Monsters of Fantasy is a production in which I will explore the truly horrific side of the fantasy world known as Dungeons and Dragons. There are content warnings in the show notes below. Episode 7, The Owlbear.
Story given by Walter Hobbs regarding his discovery and subsequent care for the monster known as the Owlbear. Hello, I am Walter Hobbs. I am and always have been a normal, simple person. There is nothing special about me at all. I am a simple 37-year-old human male. I have a very simple and unforgettable face, and I run a simple shoe upholstery called Cobbler Hobbs. I got the business from my father, who was also handed the keys from a few generations down the line. This was just how things were for us. I'm not saying it like a bad thing. Every society has to have roles to function, and my family provided the role of a local cobbler. As long as I passed the name and shop down to the next generation, then I've served my very simple role in life. I don't even have to worry about meeting a woman like my father went mad about before his death, because I could just easily adopt from the local orphanage. What I'm getting at is as long as I just made shoes my entire life and did nothing else, then maybe the tragedies that befell my small town wouldn't have happened. You see, I was inside my little shop, and Trenton from down at the winery had dropped off a pair of his dress shoes. Said that he'd be needing to go all the way up north to Voron to try and set up a trade with all the taverns there. Said he needed it by the next morning. He even paid me double what I'd normally charge, half of it up front. Now normally this wouldn't be a problem if he had told me in the morning. I'd close up shop for the day and focus on my craft. I could get a new pair of shoes made from some pretty good leather in about 8 to 10 hours. But of course he told me right as I was closing up shop for the day. And I was already planning on working on some other orders that night. But Trenton has always been good to us, and I could use the extra gold. I agreed to make him a new pair of shoes by the next morning, and quickly started setting up my shop for the night. The process of shoemaking is long and laborious. Carving the wood, stenciling the soles, curing the leather, and on and on and on. It's just a lot of fiddling, cutting, and smoothing using your hands or small tools. I do all of this normally throughout the day while talking to customers or just to people passing through the center of town. I like talking to everyone who would walk throughout the day. It passed the time, and it was nice to get the rare sight of an adventurer. They happen to be really good for gold. So, that paired with my talkative shopkeep nature, I put my workbench right in front of the large glass display, at the top of which it had red painted-on lettering that named the establishment. But now it was chipping away. It was while staring up at the full moon perfectly centered around the crackled O on Hobbs that I heard the sounds of a squeaking cartwheel. I looked further out the window and saw down the road an old single cart carriage. The wood was splitting and rotting, but yet somehow it managed to hold itself upright despite the precious cargo. A massive tower covered in tattered cloth, but before I could ever train my eyes on the cargo, I realized the torches that I thought the driver was carrying to be an actual part of the horse. I leaned my face against the glass in horror as I watched the black-haired mass of muscle barrel its way towards me. Flames poured out of its eyes and nose, melting into a long curtain of fire that made its mane. I was now sweating as this barreling horse from hell was running through our town. I started to get up and run after it, maybe to shout and have someone else witness this. But I froze as I rose out of the chair, my eyes locked with the driver of the cart. He was human, or at least looked like it. He had dark brown skin and had long, thick braided hair that draped down to his shoulders. He wore a puffy white undershirt under a black leather vest. In the vest pocket was a long gold chain that looped and cupped into a monocle, the glass of which seemed to be pure black. His other eye looked bloodshot, like he had been up for a very long time, and the whites were now yellowed. However, he was smiling at me, with his feet kicked up and one hand holding the reins. The other one, a pale white glove, was waving at me in the night. I got up and started out of my shop to go say something, but as soon as I made it outside, the flaming horse and old rickety carriage were already fading into the night. And I mean that quite literally. I ran out and watched the entire thing vanish right in front of my eyes. I sat there for a moment thinking I was crazy and had just been up too long. Then my eyes noticed it in the full moonlight. A simple wooden crate. I knew it had to fallen off the man's cart. No one else had been on the road for a few hours, and I knew it wasn't there when I stepped out and smoked my pipe a few hours ago. So now the only question was whether or not I should go investigate the box. Seeing as I had no proof of the horse from hell, I felt like I was owed something. Technically what I was doing was stealing though, despite the victim being from the 9 hells. So I quietly grabbed the crate and brought it back into my shop. The crate wasn't that large, maybe 3 feet in dimensions, and was made from simple, ordinary-looking wood panels. I saw relatively new-looking spikes driven into the top to keep the crate shut. There was one other marking indicating the direction the box should be transported. However, nothing noted what would be inside the crate. I keep a crowbar near my workbench, and in no time I had the spikes ripped out and the top opened. Inside, I saw a pearl that had to be the size of a cannonball, resting on a bed of straw and next to what was a folded piece of paper. Except the longer I looked at this perfectly smooth orb, I started seeing small blue veins underneath the surface. At the time, I still thought it was some sort of gem, and while it was a full moon, I couldn't get a good look at it. I went to my bed chambers and grabbed my oil lantern and lit it. I brought the flame light towards the large pearl, but as the flames drew closer, I quickly realized how transparent the shell actually was. It was clear I was not looking at some rock or valuable stone, but rather a large egg, the contents of which were shifting and reacting to the dancing flames around it. I saw a black shape twisting and writhing inside, and what looked like to be a beak smack against the sides of the shell. I jumped back, startled, almost dropping the lantern. After collecting my composure, though, I went back over to the crate. Whatever was inside seemed to be quelled, but if I held my light close to it, I could see that it was still moving inside. I grabbed the paper that was next to it and tried to read it, except I couldn't read Elvish, and I balled up the paper and tossed it to the side. I would later find out, after getting someone to translate for me what the letter read. Honestly, I wouldn't have done me any good anyway. The now crumpled contents read, "My dear L, I hear Nasher has gone completely missing since we've gotten back. Look, I'm going to lay low. If you ever run into Warren, don't tell him you've heard from me. I packaged this up for you. Figured you could sell it at your new business. It's a one-of-a-kind, and it's worth lots of money. Just try selling it before it hatches." And it was signed with a flourished K, and then in smaller prints, Ray with 2 Y's. I finished with no time to spare, as Trenton came with wagons of wine early in the morning before the sun broke past the mountains. After he thanked me and paid me the remainder of his doubled balance, I decided to close up shop for the day. The next thing I should have done was investigate the egg, or at least tell someone else about it. But for some reason in my sleep-deprived state, I convinced myself it wasn't important, and that I could worry about it after I was rested. I woke up first to the loud crash of wood splintering against wood. Panicked, I thrashed around in my cot till I oriented myself towards the table I left the crate on. Sure enough, it was now lying on the ground, the contents of which spewed across my floor. The egg had begun free-rolling, not incredibly fast, but enough that when it connected with the opposite wall, whatever it was that was inside squeaked. I hesitantly got out of my bed and made my way over to pick up the egg and put it back in the crate. But as soon as my hands touched the warm surface, I felt something knock against where my palm was resting. 2 little taps. I then moved my palm to the other side and I felt the warm mass inside follow. And then again, I felt it tapping my palm. But this time the brittle shell that was containing this thing started to crack beneath my fingertips. I pulled my hand away and my heart started beating faster. Whatever it was realized that whatever it was doing was working and began tapping away at the same spot. I ran out of the room as soon as I saw the tip of a pale grayish beak forcing its way through one of the cracks. I ran out with a mixture of excitement and fear. I had no idea what was about to come out of this thing, but I knew that whatever it was a baby, and all babies can be trained, or so I believed. You see, our family never did any of the local farming, we just used our gold to buy produce. But I knew that taking care of a baby creature required food. I had no idea what type of food a baby bird would take, so I just started grabbing random stuff. I grabbed fruits that were already starting to rot a little. I grabbed a few cuts of meat where the color had long drained out of it, and would have made me sick to eat, but I figured it might work here. When I got back to the room, it had already gotten most of its head out of the egg, and I immediately dropped all the food I was holding, the contents of which splattered on the ground. It was facing away from me, but as soon as the small creature heard me into the room, it rotated its head 180 degrees around and stared at me with beady little black eyes. It opened its beak and started letting out a rapid, high-pitched chirping sound. I don't know if you've ever seen a baby owl, but without the feathers, I just saw the two little peach fuzz that covered its wrinkling and folding skin. It then started clawing at the shell from the inside. It didn't claw its way out incredibly fast or anything. It's just my mind was expecting wings and talons, and I didn't fully realize the shapes protruding out of the shell until this beaked quadruped started dragging itself across the floor towards the food that I had dropped. I watched this thing struggle immensely, its head too big for its neck to support, its legs too weak for it to stand, so instead it just used the small pads at the bottom of them to inch itself forward. It looked like some bird-beast monstrosity that just kept staring at me with cold black eyes. Eyes that were expecting me to feed it. I looked down at the ground, and the most I know about animal husbandry is that mammals need milk, and that owls, for that's what its face looked like, eat mice and stuff. I remembered hearing that birds regurgitate their food, but the thought of this thing eating out of my mouth bothered me, so instead I took out my dagger and started cutting up strips of pork into small little chunks. At this point it had made its way to my feet and was slightly pawing at my leg. It was clicking and opening its small but sharp beak while keeping its cold black eyes on me the entire time. I dropped a small piece of pork, and in an instant it vanished, and it was continuing to beg for more. After feeding it 2 more small chunks that way, it started trying to climb my leg, so I relented and picked up the pinkish creature gently to make sure it couldn't peck at my hands. It was warmer and softer than I expected, and I must admit that it was right then, as I was carrying it over to my bed, that I felt its heartbeat for the first time. And while the pieces in my head were turning that this might have been a baby owlbear that I had found, I was not prepared for the task I put before myself. Obviously, considering what happened. That's why I'm telling you all this. I know you want it for your collection or whatever. I just feel like I need to tell someone, to get it off my chest. Honestly, those next 3 months were probably the happiest I'd ever been in my life. The little guy, Alfie, as I called him, in just a matter of weeks he started molting in his feathers and was strong enough to walk around on his own. His blotchy skin had now turned into beautiful, thickly layered brown feathers. The peachy white fuzz had now turned into soft, snow-colored feathers that framed his eyes. They were no longer beady and black, and instead a deep red ring had formed around them. They still looked hungry, though. Alfie had a weird feeding schedule, but it worked out for my business quite well in the beginning. He didn't wake up until midday and would stay up late into the night, occasionally taking naps throughout. This meant that I could open up my shop in the mornings and handle all the incoming orders while Alfie slept in my room, and keep it open for the customers throughout the day. However, come noon I would close up the shop to work on the orders in privacy, or at least that's what I told the rest of the town. In actuality, I was rushing to feed Alfie before he woke up. If not, he would start screeching. And as cute as he was, he produced an ungodly, high-pitched screech when he was angry. So I made sure to keep him fed and happy so no one would know I was keeping him. Then, one afternoon, just like all the others, I had closed up shop to go back and feed Alfie. He was there on my bed, standing on his hind legs, just twisting his head to each side, slowly pawing at the air. I realized then how large he was. He hadn't been standing up all the way, but I could tell he could easily stand up to a height of almost 3 feet. And now that he was up on my bed, those cold black eyes, rimmed by crimson, were leveled with me. I walked over and started tossing the meat to him, as he no longer needed my help to cut the meat. I got closer and let him rub against me like someone would do a small dog. I was petting him on his back with my right hand and dropping strips of salmon into his mouth with my other. I hadn't given him salmon in a bit because it's a bit pricier than the local chickens and beef, but I knew it was his favorite and I felt like spoiling him. I guess my fingers still smell like salmon that afternoon, and I guess I wasn't paying as much attention as I normally do. Alfie started getting excited and was climbing onto my lap, snapping at the dangly salmon. I dropped it down its throat, but I felt Alfie dig his back claws into my leg and jump up, and with one clean, almost surgical motion, my ring and pinky finger were rolling around on the floor. Blood started spraying out of the stumps, and I watched Alfie lap at the air with his tongue. It then pounced to the ground to chase after my fingers that had rolled underneath the bed. Horrified, I dropped the rest of the fish and ran out of the room, clutching my hand. I had long gotten a lock made for the room, but I struggled to lock the door back, the key slipping in my hand from all the blood. I made it to the local healer Malin in a hurry, but because it was the middle of the day, the entire town saw me running like an idiot, and I had to make up some story about cutting my fingers while I was cutting some leather that seemed probably half believable. It was as I was returning back to the shop, though, that I started hearing the murmurs and rumors. They were calling me weird and crazy. I heard whispers of a monster. Were they talking about me? Or Alfie? I ran back to the shop to see the people being the nosy denizens they were, looking around my shop. They all gave me odd glances and asked if I was okay, and backed out upon my arrival. One person, I think Joffrey the Barbensurger, was saying that he should call the town guard, but luckily he was hushed out pretty quickly. After all, my family had been here for years. They all backed out and let me lock up the shop and close the drapes. As I did so, the light faded away and I could no longer see the blood trail that led to my room. However, I could still hear the door shaking on its hinges as Alfie shrieked and called loudly. I knew that shriek. He did it the first time I fed him salmon, and wouldn't stop till I gave him the rest of it. Alfie had gotten a taste of fresh blood, and he wanted more. I didn't blame him for what he did. It wasn't his fault, honestly. And aside from the occasional phantom limb syndrome, I was fine. He is a beast and he needs to eat real meat. It was my fault for not letting him hunt up until that point. It was because of my stupidity, my life as I knew it was ruined, not Alfie's. I bet you're wondering how this led up to the events of that massacre. That the townfolk should have been aware, right? Well, I'll skip ahead past the boring months of hiding in the woods miles away from civilization. Before I left, I had spent all my gold in manufacturing large manacles with 200 feet worth of chains, a new bow and quiver with 50 arrows, and as much non-perishable food as possible. You see, the plan was to use the chains and train Alfie out in the wild, and eventually, when he was able to be around people, I could bring him back. I had heard of owlbears being in circuses and stuff, so it wasn't unheard of. Except, over the months it seemed that Alfie preferred the life of hunting and foraging. He started playing with me less and less, and my commands started meaning nothing to him. He would only do what he wanted to do. I was just merely a friendly companion to him. I lost track of time while I was out there. It couldn't have been more than 6 months, and we were starting to get ready for winter. I could tell Alfie was putting on weight and eating more for hibernation. I was happy at that thought. Alfie just sleeping for months on end. Except that never came to be, because one afternoon when I woke up I noticed the fallen tree, the base of which had been gouged out at a sharp angle, and the bundle of chains that were wrapped around it long gone. I panicked and looked around, but Alfie had long made his escape. Luckily, a clumsy owlbear bound in chains makes a nice trail. One that was leading straight back to Little Point. Now, I know you've heard the story, but I want to tell you my side of it, not the side those heroes told you. I obviously didn't make it in time, Actually, throughout this entire thing, I was pitifully useless. By the time I made it to town, everyone who could have locked themselves away had done so, and they were either cowering in fear or screaming at the top of their lungs. I saw about 6 bodies smeared across the ground, limbs trailing behind them. The first one I noticed was the mincemeat body that belonged to Malin, her eyes plucked out along with the surrounding flesh of her eye sockets. I looked over and saw a stray leg, at the bottom of which was a nice pair of dress shoes. I vomited and sat there coughing until the sounds of loud shouting and screeching had caught my attention. I cleaned the vomit off my shirt and ran around the corner, careful not to trip over the body of Joffrey's boy, Kevin. The first thing I saw was Alfie covered in blood, screeching as a severed arm was below him. On top of him was a halfling, screaming at the top of his lungs, blood coating his beard. He had wrapped chains around Alfie's neck and was attempting to strangle him. Alfie reared back, trying to throw the halfling off, and I realized my cute little cub was now towering 6 feet in the air and had razor-sharp claws. I could see bits of gore stuck and matted into his feathers. This elvish man with long blonde hair and a long green robe was shouting something arcane, and then I saw this giant spectral hand appear above the halfling and plucked him out of the air as he was cursing and yelling at the elf. I was very confused and just kind of stood there for a moment. Then the rather large fellow who was standing about 10 feet in front of Alfie hoisted one of his warhammers into the air and started charging at him. He was a massive man and was wearing very expensive-looking armor. His hammer started arcing and glowing with white flame. The large man started rushing at Alfie, and I felt all my hair stand up on end, and my skin crawled as the energy around me rushed into his hammer. Then I heard a loud, bleating shout, and everything became silent. Between the large man and Alfie appeared a bovine humanoid. I've only seen 1 or 2 in my time, but I believe they're called furbolgs. She was adorned in flowers and was wearing a long yellow sundress. It looked like she dyed some of her hair pink to match some of the flowers in her crown. She was screaming at the large man, and then screamed at Alfie. I couldn't understand what language she was speaking, but they seemed to be having an argument. The elf hoisted the halfling in the air, and the halfling was screaming about not wanting pets. The large man seemed to be agreeing with him. At this point, I hid back around the corner so they wouldn't see me. The bovine lady seemed to be winning this argument. Everyone had lowered their weapons, and they all stood around talking. And to my surprise, so was Alfie. He just kind of stood there, nodding along like he knew what they were saying. Then everything happened very quickly. 1 second they were all talking and arguing back and forth with each other, and the furbolg had walked over to a nearby oak tree. I then saw her place her hand on the oak tree, and I watched the bark start peeling away, and inside I saw the spiraling rings of the tree that indicate age. However, they were moving and shifting and spiraling towards the center of the tree. Quickly, all of them ran into the tree, including Alfie. I don't know what came over me, but I used all of my strength to sprint into the spiraling tree. My entire vision started spiraling along with the patterns of the tree. I was spiraling towards the center, but every inch it felt like I was moving closer. I could not see any advancement. All I just saw was the continual spiraling, sickening motion drawing me towards the center. Then my perspective shifted, and I was no longer being sucked in, but rather funneled out of the sappy bark. I found the spirals propelling me outward until I saw this massive castle overlooking the cliff edge. The rest you obviously know. So, there's my story. Tell Alfie I'm sorry. End of story. The story of that attack is quite famous, one of the reasons anyone even knows of Little Point. Except, he's right, the story is told quite differently, mostly to paint the group in a different, more heroic light. Look, I'm a lore bard, and I've read countless books in the past. The story of the Owlbear massacre had a lot more embellishment in it. But because Nico only keeps notes about his monsters, I have no idea who the rest of the party were. Since this is the only version we know is true, I think the one that I heard that had an all-human cast was just a work of fiction. It makes sense because the person described here clearly seems like Bartimaeus, and I can't help but to think that he was also describing Warren Joy. I wonder who else was present, but whenever I brought it up to Nico, he just kind of kept saying, "Who?" like an owl, and laughed under his breath. If it weren't for the massive amounts of gold you paid us, I'd think you were senile, Nico. Hell, you just might be. The driver also comes up in some other stories here. He likes to call himself Yonto. While no one here has personally met Yonto, it seems that he is heavily involved in the trade of illegal and dangerous magic items, both rare and cursed. I advise if anyone listening sees the described driver, they do not trust whatever it is he's trying to sell them. The Owlbear. Owlbears are quite known. They are large monstrosities that date back pre-apocalypse, and Mr. Hobbs was correct. The owlbear has been known to be domesticated, but it's extremely hard to do so. It is recommended that if you encounter a wild owlbear that you try and get away before it notices you. Physiology. True to its namesake, it's pretty much an owl with the body of a bear, and like many owls and bears, they can be found in many diverse biomes, thus giving them different plumage, fur? Either way, you can find Arctic variants or forest variants like the ones featured in this story. What they all share, though, is the common thick layers of fat, massive hulking shape, and sharp claws of the bear. They contain the feathers, face, and vocal cords of the owl. Now let me reiterate, they have the size and strength of a bear. It is laughable that Mr. Hobbs tried restraining one. The owlbear is not necessarily a smart creature, but the different tools it possesses from its two drastically different animals help it be a formidable monster. The eyes that it gets from the owl heritage allow it to see in the dark, and even though it has a beak, this creature's smell is actually stronger than that of a bear's. This creature, while origins unknown, seems magical. However, throughout the years of documented research, we know that there is nothing magical aiding this creature at all. It has no weaknesses or resistances or any kind of affinity to magic. It can be hurt and killed like any normal creature. Because of its simple beast-like nature, to say attack is odd. It just wants to kill and eat you, honestly. It'll use its claws to shred you apart, and it'll use its massive weight and size to hold you down, and it'll use its beak to pluck out whatever parts of the meat it wants to eat. However, it doesn't really think and attack like some of our other monsters. Welp, that is another entry, Nico. I must say, I'm beyond excited for next month. It's the Festival of the Dead, and it seems that everyone here at the castle enjoys the autumny time of year. Luna and Cadwin have prepared some special stories that might fit the mood. Oh, I'm so excited! Goodbye!
If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your friends and family. Follow us on Twitter at monstersof_ for all news and teasers for upcoming episodes. Today's story was inspired by the campaign events that led to my friends and I getting an owlbear as a pet. I decided to tell the story of Walter Hobbs, a man who found out the hard way that an owlbear is one of the oldest but appropriately named monsters. Join us next week as I begin our Halloween special that will focus on some more traditionally spooky monsters. These Halloween-based stories will continue all month of October. Thank you for listening. Until next time.